From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. There's an aspect of pollinator protection that often goes overlooked because it seems to have nothing to do with pollinators. And what I'm talking about is keeping invasive insects out of an area. Now, you'll remember we had an episode with Dr. Dave Smitley from Michigan State University where he made the bold claim that actually we can manage most of our pests without using a lot of insecticides if we kept those exotic insects out. Now, one insect that's of particular concern here in Western Oregon, but also for listeners in other states, is Japanese beetle. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to bring a close friend and collaborator, Dr. Jessica Rendon from Oregon Department of Agriculture. She wears many, many hats. One of the hats she wears is she's a Japanese beetle eradication specialist. This beetle causes devastation in its path. We're going to hear about efforts that Jessica's involved with to eradicate this beetle from around the Portland area. In addition, we're going to wrap round to the end of the episode where we're going to get bee geeky. Jessica knows a lot about native bees, and so at the end of the episode, we'll kind of turn our beetle hats off and go back to bees. Anyways, I'm really excited for you to get this episode. Jessica Rendon from Oregon Department of Agriculture this week on Pollination. All right. I am so pleased to have with me today Dr. Jessica Rendon from Oregon Department of Agriculture. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's so nice to be here.
We work really closely together on the Oregon Bee Project. You are the representative on the steering committee of the Oregon Bee Project, and we talked just last week. We were working on the phase 2, the second strategic plan for Oregon.
Yeah, we've been working on that now, and I'm really excited. All the edits we go through each time, it gets better and better, and I think we're getting really close to having that final document for the coming years.
I was so excited. I got an email from you just a couple days ago, and you had all the entomologists over there in your division. You came up with a list of like Oregon pollinators. It was very fascinating how many different pollinating species outside of bees there are.
Yeah, it's not just bees. You got some beetles and flies, some moths. Yeah, they get overlooked, but they're doing some pollination too.
And that list, it's great. It was a nicely put together list, and that list will be in the next strategic plan. So when it comes out, folks, you really want to check it out.
Yeah.
Okay, but we're not here to talk about pollinators. We're talking about something related to pollinators. And, you have been working really closely with Oregon Department of Agriculture and Japanese beetles. Why, if people are worried about pollinator health, why do you need to be worried about Japanese beetles?
So Japanese beetles, they're an extremely invasive insect that the Department of Agriculture were always on the lookout for. One of the reasons is because they will be completely devastating to almost all of our crops and ornamental plants that people have in their yard. And what would come from that if the beetle were to become established in Oregon is a huge increase in pesticide use, both in the agricultural, nursery sector and in just people's residential yards. Pesticides they can be a really great tool when used properly, but if we can avoid having to use them in perpetuity, that would be preferable. So invasive species like the Japanese beetle are something everyone should be concerned about, especially if you're concerned about pollinators.
I remember we had a past episode with Dave Smitley in Michigan, where Japanese beetle is a problem. And I remember him pointing out that if we didn't have invasive insects, in some ways, when it comes to horticulture industries, we probably wouldn't have to use that much pesticides. It's really those invasive insects that kind of like bump pesticide use up.
Yeah, definitely. And invasive species, when they get to a different area or an area they're not supposed to be in, they don't have any specialized predators that are going to provide any top-down control. So then it's up to us as people to have to provide that control, often in the ways of chemical control, unfortunately.
Okay, so Japanese beetle, it seems like it's been knocking on Oregon's doorstep for a couple years now. Can you describe the history of Japanese beetle in Oregon and where current efforts stand at eradicating it?
Yeah, so Oregon has a very long history of looking for and battling the Japanese beetle. I think we've been trapping in Oregon for 70 years or something. And
oh, wow.
The 1980s, I think, is when trapping became bigger. More traps out there specifically for the Japanese beetle. So we've been always looking for it. In the 80s, in Cave Junction and in Tigard, there were a couple smaller successful eradication events. I think, again, in Cave Junction in the early 2000s, there was another population that was found. But again, we were able to successfully eradicate it. That's a tricky word. So, yeah, Oregon has had a history of finding the beetles and eradicating them. For many, many years, we always find a few beetles at the Portland airport. They're often brought in as stowaways on air cargo. So finding beetles here and there and taking care of them is nothing new for Oregon. However, in 2016, was the big year for us. We found 369 beetles in the Cedar Mill, Bethany area of Oregon. And that was a huge amount of beetles to find in one area. So since 2016, we've been in a full-scale eradication mode, trapping for the beetle and higher level density trapping where the beetle is in the Cedar Mill area, and doing our eradication where we use targeted insecticides on people's lawns to reduce the population there and hopefully eradicate them completely.
Tell us a little bit about what we know has been going on with that population since 2016. It seems like it's contained, but is it kind of coming back?
Yeah, let me bring up my little slide on my end that shows the numbers. So the short answer is yes, we are decreasing the population. If we continue with this decrease, we will be able to eradicate them. However, it's really a year-to-year thing. So just for example, last year 2019 compared to 2020, we reduced the overall population by roughly 45%. The year prior, we reduced it by 56% overall. So that's really great. Last year, we found only 4,490 beetles total, which is great that it's going down so much. However, this last year and the year prior, what we find beetles kind of spreading out from that main area. And so that is really a challenge and concerning, because even though we're decreasing the population, if we continue to see spread, it just makes it so much more difficult to contain. At this point in time, we still believe we can do it. But we just have to play it by year to year to see what our chances are.
Okay, well, tell us. Come back to sort of what the future may hold in store. But can you walk us through the different tactics that ODA employs to get towards eradication? And I particularly want to focus in on what steps are being obviously killing an insect. There's bees all over that area. What steps are being taken to ensure pollinators are minimally impacted by the eradication efforts?
Yeah, so our eradication is kind of two-pronged. So we trap for Japanese beetle throughout the state always, and specifically where the beetle is known to be, we trap in higher densities. So hopefully when the beetles go into the traps, they're not able to mate and reproduce. So hopefully that is one way of reducing the population. But the major way we're able to attack this beetle is through the insecticides that we use. So our first line, or our main line of defense, is treating turf grass and ornamental planting beds with Acetyloprin G. It's a targeted insecticide for white grubs in the soil. And then a second or third tactic, I guess, is we spray foliage of plants that the beetle likes and where the beetle is in the highest density to help kind of reduce that population as a 1-2 punch between the granular and the foliar spray. So yeah, trapping and the treatment is our main two ways of trying to get this beetle under control. And going back to pollinators, pollinators are one of our main concerns as for the Department of Agriculture. So many of our agricultural plants, our specialty crops, are dependent upon honeybees in particular to pollinate them. So yeah, that's obviously a major concern. I'll start with the traps. So the traps themselves are not really attractive to pollinators. We do find some bumblebees and honeybees in them here and there, but it's such a minuscule amount. I'm sure your listeners have heard, driving your car kills so many more insects. And so the amount of bycatch we have in our traps is so incredibly small. And I think last year, the USDA and some other researchers did an experiment to see what color of Japanese beetle traps and what lures would be the least attractive to pollinators. And the color traps we use, the green, all solid green, are the least attractive to pollinators. And the lure, I had to double check if our lure is the one they recommended for least pollinator bycatch, but that came out last year, 2 years ago. So
cool.
Double check. Yeah. And then getting back to pollinators and the second side of what we do, the pesticide application. So in 2016, when they found the Japanese beetle in the Cedar Mill area, our task force came together between ODA, USDA, other organizations in the state to figure out what would be the best course of action and products to use. Of course, considering the environmental and human impact. And so that's how we chose the product we currently use, Acelepryn G, because it's known by the EPA to be a reduced risk insecticide for people, pollinators, wildlife. There's no caution words or reentry period of the product, and there's no many pesticides have those little bee boxes that say what to do to minimize the impact of pollinators. But because Acelepryn already has such an incredibly low negative impact, that there's no special thing you have to do.
Acelepryn, in the pesticide training I do around the state, we often have exercises, and Acelepryn is one of the exercises because there is not even in environmental hazards does it mention bees. It's when there is potential for bee exposure, it is, one of the better products to use. That's great. And I guess the other thing is it's in a granular form, so it's like going right into the soil. Yeah,
exactly. The bees aren't, there's no flowers in the dirt. So,
yeah. Okay, but then you also talked about the foliar treatments, and those, I guess, you're finding you got a persistent hot spot, and then if you didn't do that, the beetle will get away. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in 2019 and 2020 were our 2 years where we used the foliar spray, just in an attempt to get a handle on the population. We only spray it's roughly 10 or so plant species, the ones that are most attracted to the beetle, and we're only treating a very small subset of the overall treatment area, just again to be as cautious and environmentally conscious as possible. If we're going to use a spray, we want to do it the least amount but the most impactful to get rid of the beetle.
Yeah.
And yeah, overall, if we don't stop this beetle, it's the increase in pesticide use is just going to be, I don't like to think about it. I hope we can avoid that situation.
Well, I guess that's my last question for you is what's ahead for 2021? I imagine every kind of something like a big, large eradication project that involves going into homeowners' backyards during a pandemic was a challenge for ODA.
Yes, that's an understatement.
So what's ahead for 2021? You're probably in the depths of planning this whole thing again.
Yeah, we are. The ball is rolling all over again. We're going to do pretty much the same thing we did last year, essentially. We are been finalizing our treatment map based on where and how many beetles we caught last year. We're almost finalized with that, and then we'll start sending out consent letters to all the residents that are in the treatment area. And we'll have to play it by ear, how we do our outreach. I think we're going to do some webinars for people to attend. Obviously, we don't want to have people coming into a room, hundreds of people in a room with us. So we'll be sending out some kind of outreach in that way.
Well, I remember early on in the program, it was remarkable as ODA was able to get very high levels of compliance. ODA's done a remarkable job really emphasizing the importance of Japanese beetle eradication. And it's people are really on board.
Yeah, I think roughly over 98% of people consent every year. It's been the people in this area are incredible to work with and to communicate with, and they have a lot of great questions and they want to know what we're doing and what we're using. And so I'm really impressed that they want to know, and they don't just sign a paper. They really want to be engaged and know the situation. So that's great.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break. I have a set of questions to ask all my guests. I am looking forward to a fellow steering committee Oregon Bee Project members' answers, so we'll be right back in just a second. Okay, we are back. I am so curious what your pollinator book recommendation is going to be.
Okay, so for pollinator book, I'm sure someone has already mentioned it, but I'd have to go with the Bees in Your Backyard,
yes.
A Guide to North American Pollinators. It's just an extremely great introductory. Well, it's not just introductory because it really goes into identification of the bee families here in North America. There's great pictures, life biology and history descriptions. So yeah, I'll go with that one for my favorite pollinator book.
It is remarkable, and I was really excited. I got an email from Olivia Messenger Carroll. They're going to be releasing the bees of Eastern U.S. in March. And she has agreed to come on as a guest at the book launch. So we'll be hearing from Olivia, which is always a delight. But the other thing I think is worth mentioning, those high quality images, people in Oregon are used to those high quality images because they're on the postcards that we distribute and all the Oregon Bee Project material. And I think it's worth saying that this comes out of your lab. Your lab is where all this remarkable imaging gets done in Oregon.
Yeah, they do incredible work in the lab. I'm just incredibly impressed.
That I remember when we asked we've had one legislator, Representative Jeff Reardon was on the show, and he said his favorite book was the ODA book on bees because it had such great pictures. So, okay, Our next question is, what is your go-to tool? When you're doing work with pollinators, what do you absolutely must have?
So this one, I had to say, it's my microscope that my parents got me a couple years back. My mom found a retired entomologist and bought this used microscope from him. And they drove up all the way from Sacramento, California, up to here, Portland, Oregon, because it was too big to fit in the plane cargo spaces. So they drove all the way up just to bring me this microscope for Christmas. And even though it doesn't have quite the best resolution as some of the microscopes in our lab, it just feels so great to use that microscope from them, especially, these days. I haven't seen them in so long. It's so nice. Every time I use it, I just feel so connected to them, even though they're far away.
It's worth saying people who were in the flagship farm program, a lot of those bees you identified, and you've also been a participant in the bee school, the 5-day native bee taxonomy course here at OSU.
Yeah, I have so thoroughly enjoyed becoming more involved in the bee world. There's so much to learn. There's so many good books. And identifying the flagship farm bees was, I can't even call it work. I could do that all day. It's so fun.
Well, I suppose, Jessica, you're the kind of the bee person in your division, like the person people go to when they have bee questions from ODA.
Yeah, I guess by default, I guess. So I do have, my background is in entomology. I have a PhD in entomology, but that was in biological control. And so I had a very, broad overview of pollinators, but coming into ODA and getting more involved with these programs, I've tried to be a sponge and absorb as much information about pollinators, and I'm learning more every day, and I hope I can, better serve Oregon and Oregonians the more I learn.
You do a great job. Well, I guess our last question is, given that you are kind of like the pollinator person at ODA, what do you have a favorite pollinator species?
Yeah, so it was hard to pick one. I was originally going to pick one of our, kleptoparasites from Oregon, but I thought I'd go a little more crazier just to share like really interesting bees from around the world. There's these bees from South and Central America, the vulture bees. They're also known as like carrion bees. They're in the genus Trigona. So as people know, most bees are herbivores. They drink nectar and collect pollen, but these vulture bees, they actually feed off of dead animals. So that's how they get their protein, is from the dead animals, not from pollen from flowers.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's an incredibly rare thing, So I just find that's just so interesting. They're so unique. So that's my... Oh, go ahead.
I often think like the pollinator, the people's choices for these 3 questions is kind of like a Rorschach test on their personality. And I was just like, that is Jessica kind of finding the most kind of like unique, interesting thing. You're always looking and always bringing up wonderful mysteries to us. I always love getting an email from you.
Well, then my final bee is even more crazy and unique.
Ooh, okay.
A bee from South Africa. It's in I probably won't pronounce it right. Rediviva genus.
Uh-huh.
It's in the family Melitidae, so it's a type of oil collecting bee, and they have the longest arms of any bee. Their forearms are like twice the length of their body.
Wow.
They look like aliens, and I guess that's an adaptation for collecting the oil that's way down inside the flower. So their arms are incredibly long and spindly looking. I highly recommend looking them up.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for those, Jessica. And thank you so much for giving us a little update on what's going on with Japanese beetle. Let's hope in the next couple of years, Japanese beetle no more in Oregon.
Yeah, I hope so. That's what we're working towards.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn, Sin, and Neil, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollination.podcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.